Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Rebekah Brown is on a mission to reframe midlife as a superpower. She's the founder and chief guinea pig at MPowder, the world's first plant-based supplement powder range crafted to target the three distinct biochemical stages of the menopause. Launched in September 2020, it is a brand born from curiosity, co-creation and community. From an early career as part of a war room providing 24-hour rapid response creative support to Tony Blair's Labour Party during the historic 1997 election campaign, to leading campaigns on behalf of some of the world's leading creative agencies and brands, Rebekah's story is one of creativity, innovation, disruption and purpose. So what is the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. So, Rebekah Brown, good afternoon. Welcome to the Astrology Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, and great to have you on as our guest. As is customary with discussions on astrology, I like to start with the early days and a bit of background as to childhood in particular. So tell us, where did you grow up and what was childhood like for you?
Wow, it's like a psychology session. So for me, my history is very straightforward. I'm a Fen girl, so I grew up in Ely in Cambridgeshire. I'm the eldest of three. I grew up in a very it's a very stable, safe, small place, the kind of place where people would call you at work if you'd left your washing on the line. It was incredibly dull as a teenager, but incredibly, now as a parent, I know probably an incredibly sort of reassuring place in which to raise a family because everybody knew your business, everybody looked out for everyone else. And so that gave me a really good grounding, I think, for life. I went to the local state school, but then everyone did. There really wasn't any choice. There was just one school and we all went to it. A lot of my friends, grew up on farms and I'm from farm stock as well. So, a lot of my mates ended up going into the sort of the family business. And so it's quite rare to go to college or to leave Ely, actually. So for me, sort of leaving to go to university was a really big step and sort of set me on a very different path to a lot of my peers, but also was quite nerve-wracking because I wasn't doing it with everyone else.
Am I right in thinking you studied drama and English at Bristol? You read drama and English.
Yeah.
So when did you first start to show an interest in the arts and I guess particularly the performing arts in the shape of drama?
The interesting thing about my family is that the scenario I've just described to you, sort of a farming stock was my father's side of the family, and my mother's side of the family is sort of quite academic and curious and very involved in literature and the arts generally. And that probably is what inspired me, because growing up in Ely, there wasn't necessarily the exposure to the clubs and the spotting of talent or potential that you'd get perhaps in a place with more diversity and more options for extracurricular activity. But I was relatively close to Cambridge and I had a grandfather who basically decided that I should be doing something with my brain. And so he inspired me. He was a really big influence on my life right up until, when he died. I ended up settling in London to be near him. And I had a really inspirational drama teacher. So from about the age of 13, he took me under his wing. He encouraged me. He was an outsider in the sense that in Ely, quite a lot of the teachers grew up in Ely. It's one of those places. And so he was an outsider. He came from a big city to Ely to teach, and he had a very different view of the world. And he took all of us actually as drama students and introduced us to summer camps that were happening in London that we could apply for. And he took us to the National Theatre on coach trips, and suddenly this whole world of theatre and literature opened up, and he believed in me. So he actually helped me with my application. He came to see my performances in Bristol. And so he as a teacher really sort of helped me find my path in the arts.
And do you remember that first time on stage? Was there a sort of pivotal moment through childhood where you felt actually the thrill, if you like, or the buzz that comes from performance, nerve-wracking though it may well have been, I'm sure, but nonetheless, was there that sort of pivotal moment when you think, actually, this is something that I can really see myself progressing towards?
Well, I mean, the hilarious thing, and as an adult, you sort of look back on these dreams you hold as a child or a young adult, and I wasn't very good. I think what used to fascinate me about theatre was the window into other people's lives that literature and art brings. And for me, I'm an academic really, and I've obviously ended up in research for much of my career. And that probably is the red thread that goes from when I was very young right through to where I am now, is that what fascinated me about theatre and about storytelling and performance was that ability to feel like you were in someone else's world and you could learn from that world and you'd become a richer person, as a result of experiencing these stories and walking in someone else's shoes for a while. And that really fascinated me. And very quickly, I knew that the sort of the adrenaline you describe, I found really unpleasant. I didn't get that kind of performer's rush. I got, petrifying anxiety that I never quite overcame. And so when I got to university, I was fascinated by the process of emotional engagement and the process of telling someone's story with integrity and authenticity. And I very quickly moved behind the scenes. So, I did my degree at Bristol, and, most of my time was in set design or looking at the impact of lighting on, your emotional response, or, doing the kind of geeky research side of theatre was what fascinated me. Understanding how the discipline worked and kind of unpicking it as a sort of mechanism was what I ended up spending most of my time doing. So I loved the arts, but I discovered very quickly that I was never going to be someone who was a performer.
Interesting. So tell us, how did you go from drama and English and a first-class honours degree at Bristol, which is fabulous, congratulations, and how do you end up, well, I suppose, providing that creative, rapid response support as part of a team advising what ultimately became the Blair government, but in those kind of landmark historic 1997 elections? How do you go from student at Bristol to all of a sudden playing a role in arguably all elections shape countries, but particularly 97? It was a really massive shift in the UK political landscape at that time. How did you end up there?
By a sort of series of sort of happy coincidences, which I think is, when you look back at a career and when you talk to young adults about how you ended up in a certain industry, I think the thing that's fascinating, and this must resonate for you in your day job, is so many of the roles that are available to us we don't even hear about. No one talks about these jobs in your career sessions when you're doing your A-levels or you're thinking about what you want to do with your life. And yet there are these industries that operate that you only really discover when you start saying yes to things. And what happened for me is I was due to go back to university to do a PhD. So I got my first, and I was fascinated by, I think the world is glad that I didn't go back, but I was fascinated by Greek mythology and feminist theatre. I kind of got this whole theory around what I was going to write, and I thought it was a very valuable text that the world needed. I think we can all be thankful that the funding the funding at the time from the Arts Council, I was awarded a grant, and then the actual course didn't go ahead because there weren't enough people interested in it. So I had a year in which to wait to reapply to do my Arts Council funded PhD. And during that time, I spent time in London because I have family here and I needed to get a job. And it was just by a series of talking to people, needing work, being quite academic and interested by data. And I was very politically motivated. And this role came up for me in an advertising agency to be part of a rapid response team for the Blair election campaign. And what they needed at the time was a gopher. I was literally the person working the worst shifts, doing the longest hours. And our role was to analyse the morning's news, because obviously in those days, 97 feels like a lifetime ago, but in those days it was all about what was being said in the tabloids and the broadsheets. And so you'd look at the morning headlines, you'd look at the sort of the dialogue that was occurring and the emotional response and the way that the media was interpreting stuff. And then by the deadline of the end of that day, whenever the papers were going to print, you would submit your ad with almost like a response. So I started to learn about, how language can help control and manage dialogue, and how imagery can influence whether people want to donate in terms of the fundraising that Labour was doing at the time. Because if you remember, the thing about politics at that moment in time, it was a very poor place to be. It was very difficult to raise funds in order to generate the attention that you needed. And so Labour at the time was reframing the whole of that political landscape. They were learning from the Clinton campaign. They were They were working out how to get these what they called 1,000 club members, these people that would donate, significant amounts of money, or significant for that moment in time, of £1,000 or more. And so a lot of my role was about, how do you engage with that consumer to ensure that they feel that their money is going to be well spent, and they understand the purpose of becoming a Labour member, because the Labour membership at the time was really low. So it was all about understanding people. And I guess that's where that, again, back to that red thread, it then started to really fascinate me. And so I had every intention of going back to university, but I got involved in this campaign, and then kind of the rest is history. I ended up staying in the advertising industry for my whole career until starting MPowder.
And to your point around the pivotal role that particularly the newspapers would have played, as I recall, I have a vague recollection, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but of The Sun, which historically had been a conservative leading newspaper. I don't quite know what the headline might have been, but there was a very clear, sort of the Murdoch empire comes out and backs Blair. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately, I think they may even have claimed the credit for ultimately his election in some way, shape or form. But it must have been fascinating at that time to be coming in on a daily basis, and those newspapers being, as to your point, where we find ourselves today, it's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? But the newspapers have been so pivotal in shaping ultimately an election outcome.
Yeah, I know. It's fascinating, isn't it? And I think now it's even more fascinating, because you look at the sort of the way that we get our news and the sources that we trust, in this particular moment in time, having just come through a global pandemic, and the challenges that media, traditional media has faced, the accusations probably quite rightly placed upon them in terms of bias. And we've ended up with a very fragmented environment in which content and stories and facts have completely changed in terms of how we value them. But at the time, it feels like it was a very simplistic phase in life. But at the time, what we were doing with Labour was kind of groundbreaking. So Clinton, as a campaign, had learned about how to really utilise direct mail, and the company that I was working for was very famous at the time, because they were the originators of the club card, the Tesco club card. So I was working in an environment where data was being used in ways that had never been done before. We were learning about the impact of knowing what was in someone's shopping basket in terms of knowing their mindset and their life stage, and whether they were pregnant or whether they were likely to be getting divorced, and, the kind of messaging that would come about. And it was a sort of a time of innocence where all we could think about, or all I was thinking about, was the common good that could come from tailoring and enhancing the way that brands were interacting with consumers. And obviously, with all of these things, we look at technology now, and there's some real challenges about how much they know. But at the time, it was a really exciting place to be, because the Labour Party team benefited from that kind of commercial understanding of habits and behaviours and wants and needs that was being played out in the sort of the Tesco club card team. And also we were learning from Clinton in terms of how you engage with people with stuff that's coming through their letterbox, and direct mail was invaluable to Labour. But again, you look at that as a channel now, and it's really not something we talk about.
Well, I think, if I'm right in saying that data is now more valuable on a global basis than oil. But at that time, you would have been at the inception of the club card, but that very, shaping the way that data was used to inform business decisions, marketing decisions, advertising decisions, messages. What did you learn from that early experience, do you think?
I think what I learned, and it's sort of, it has stayed with me, was just the importance of understanding humans and not looking to categorize. I think the danger with big data particularly, and with any form of data, is that you have that desire to segment, and you have that desire to place narrative onto something as opposed to genuinely looking at what's there. And I think it taught me well in terms of listening to all of the narratives that were taking place and not making those leaps. And, as I sort of progressed through my career in marketing as a researcher, what I used to find fascinating was that very human desire to rewrite the story. So you'd go into focus groups and you'd present the data back, and yet people would want to interpret it to fit their preconceptions, to fit what they'd already decided they'd be doing with their business or their brand or their launch campaign or whatever it was you were researching. But I think because I was tutored very early on in listening to the voice and listening to these individual data sets, I've always been far more interested in the value of sort of qualitative research and narrative research, which is much harder to do, and it's messier. There's no black and white answer. But it made me really respect that above and beyond the kind of quantitative stuff that we often rely on, which is, the 47% of people say this. And it's like, well, that doesn't help me. That doesn't help me understand the nuance and the complexity of how humans behave. So I think that's what I learned there, was that you couldn't make those sweeping generalizations. In fact, the political landscape at the time had got to where it got to because they'd made some sweeping generalizations. And that understanding around nuance and the importance of actually embracing the messiness of how people think and behave, and how it's not binary was probably the most valuable thing for me at the beginning of the career.
Well, certainly I want to to spend much of this conversation talking about MPowder and all that would entail. But before we get there, your kind of first, as I understand it, at least your first experience of leadership responsibility, taking the leap as MD at Byte, respectfully, a relatively early in your career. As I reflected back through your history, I thought that looks to me kind of about 5 or 6 years into working life, and you're MD of working for founders, took a business from 4 to more than 30 people, a successful exit to a renowned international group. That must have been quite some experience, quite a ride, as the phrase would say. So what was the Byte experience? What was the Byte story for you?
Well, the Byte experience was a phenomenal, it was a life-changing experience for me. So I think the Labour Party, in terms of passion and purpose, was one of the most memorable points in my life. To be there, as you were saying, as the landscape fundamentally shifted for politics is something I'll always be proud of. Although, obviously I get blamed by my peer group now for everything that happened subsequently. But at the time, it was lovely to be part of something that felt genuinely momentous. And then, I'd had a very happy career working for a number of brands, and Byte was a design agency that I was using within another company that was more of a consultancy. They were kind of like a partner business that we used to do work with. And through a series, again, of just saying yes before I'd fully thought it through, I was given the opportunity to go and work with them. And they basically had the most beautiful design aesthetic that I had ever come across from a sort of advertising perspective. And what was fascinating about them is they've been going for about 7 years, I think. And the two founders were just, they were artists. Artists, one of whom had a very good commercial eye, and the other one was just interested in delivering the best work possible. And for that reason, they weren't making enough money. They were so focused on the beauty and the kind of the perfection of the output that they weren't valuing it sufficiently. And so the company really had 3 months of money left in the bank. And so I was their final throw of the dice. And so I came in on a freelance basis, having just had my first child as well. So the timing, I didn't make life easy for myself. But I came back to work, went straight into this role, and we basically said, let's give it 3 months. Let's see if we can win some business. And to this day, I still don't know whether it was an accidental phone call or a deliberate one, but I was working late in the office one day and effectively Volvo called. So there was only 4 of us at the time, as you were saying, in the office, and I picked up the phone, and they were looking for brand design and research. And they were looking for a company that could collaborate with their Swedish design lead. So they didn't want an agency that already was part of a network and was, I think in retrospect, probably they didn't want anyone too big or too famous or too egotistical. They just wanted people who were really, really good at their jobs and cared. And we won the account. We won the global account. And from that point onwards, we were like swans, scrabbling around the background, pretending we were much bigger than we were, until we were able to actually do it, working crazy hours. I remember, my son getting chicken pox, and because there weren't enough of us, I couldn't take time off. And so everyone had to come over to my house, and we had to take it in turns to look after Oscar whilst we were doing this massive negotiation around the next year's worth of fee. And, we would genuinely sort of, those days of those audio calls where you're sort of leaning into a microphone in order to have it, we had to set it up in my living room, and we were sort of running backwards and forwards, applying sort of the cow pole whenever we needed to apply the cow pole, getting the deck ready. The whole thing was absolute chaos. But it brought us together, and it was one of the most amazing experiences to go from being tiny and full of, integrity and beautiful work. And I think actually scaling without losing any of that, which wasn't easy at times, but we did, when we exited into Lowy Group, as you say, it was a company that had a heritage of beautiful design. They designed the Coca-Cola bottle. They were famous for that history. And so it was the biggest learning experience of my life, the most stressful, the most difficult, but it got me to where I am today, because it was also, life-changing. I was 29, 30-year-old MD, completely out of my depth, but we survived.
Thrived, arguably,
Yes.
based on where you ended up.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that experience, do you think?
I learned a lot about resilience, and I learned a lot about, I often call them extra milers, about the quality of people that come into a company when you're looking to scale and move fast. And, what I learned very rapidly was that the core team, those 3 people I joined at the very beginning, were all extra milers. So whatever needed to be done, we got it done. Somehow we got it done. And there was a brilliant expression from one of them who used to say, there's always enough hours, there just might not be enough sleep. And we kind of lived by that. And we when we brought in the right members of the team, they were equally extra milers. They'd always go that extra step. And I don't think you can teach that. And so what I learned was it was more important to get the mindset right than it was to kind of go through the CV and see how much experience as a project manager they'd had or how much data they'd analysed. It was actually, are you an extra miler? Are you going to be part of this team? And are you going to be equally happy, making the sandwiches as you are giving a presentation at, in the boardroom? And when we worked, Byte was one of the, the cultures that I've been most proud of. We did an awful lot to ensure that those extra milers were rewarded and they felt part of the team. And when I reflect and I talk to people, they're some of my best friends still. And, I've worked with them in subsequent careers because they were some of the best people I also ever had the opportunity to work with in the industry. And I think there was something quite magical about that environment, but we did put an awful lot of weight on culture. So I think that's what I learned from the experience was, the value of extra milers, the value of investing in culture. And I think, the final thing was the value of being comfortable pricing your skill accordingly. We were never greedy, but I think what we had to do when I first came on board was recognise that stuff that takes time and is beautiful has a value, and they weren't valuing their work enough, arguably, at the beginning. But we got that right, and we did some really beautiful work.
And was it that experience that first inspired you to go out on your own? Because am I right in saying you set up your own planning consultancy? That was the first foray into your own business. Was it that experience, that knowledge, giving you that fire to try something on your own? Yeah,
I think, to your point about me being a very early MD, I hadn't quite finished with Byte. And so the interesting thing for me is I felt like I understood my role. My role was to take a business that was run by 2 very, very talented individuals, look after it, grow it in a way that they were comfortable with, and then ensure they exited with, and realised the value that they put in. And they'd also been doing it for much, much longer than me. And they were, they were older than me. Keith will hate that, but he's 10 years older than me. And he's still one of my best friends. But so that was my job. My job was take our business, help us exit, help us realise the investment. And I did that, but I wasn't finished with being an MD. They kind of were. So, the other partner in the business left entirely and was able to go off and have some proper time and raise her family. And she went back into the creative industry, but in a very different way on her terms. And that's what she wanted for it. Keith actually stayed with Lowy and continued to build his role as a creative director. And he runs a really successful agency today. But I hadn't finished making something. And so I didn't choose to stay with Lowy. I wanted to make something myself. And so that's really, I guess, what Remarkable Things was. It was a very small consultancy, but I took a lot of the learnings. I worked with a lot of the people from Byte, and I wanted to just be able to do the planning and thinking bit. And at the time, the insight was that was very hard to get hold of unless you went to an A&V or a big agency. Actually getting access to planners in the same way as you get access to designers at the time was quite unusual. So it was a bespoke service around planning, which meant that small brands, entrepreneurial brands could get the thinking and the research at a price that was palatable for them.
And it's a really fascinating skill set that you've evidenced. You've got that sort of creative element and the theatre. And I think that actually there are business of itself, particularly the creative industries, there's elements of theatre or creating theatre within that in various forms. But actually to combine that with the researcher and the academic and the analyst and the data-driven decision-making, allied with an emotional intelligence and intuitive sense of the nuance and the shades of grey. That's quite an eclectic mix of skills that you're throwing into a pot, which is fascinating. Is that, do you think that to what perhaps might you attribute your early success?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think if you talk to many women, particularly at this stage of life, who work through industries that, invariably largely male dominated. I don't think I ever felt like a success. I mean, throughout my time at Byte, I felt like an imposter. I was young, I was female, I hadn't been an MD before. I genuinely didn't know what I was doing in a lot of ways, but I had this sort of, I think I have a rigor to the way that I think, that was a discipline that I was taught both in my academic time, but also as a researcher in those early days, that meant that if I didn't know something, I would know about it by tomorrow morning. That's always been my sort of protective armor. And eventually it was the thing that tripped me up, interestingly. But I researched everything to the nth degree because of a fear of being wrong. That's kind of what took me through into where I am today. But it's not necessarily, so if you hold on to it too tightly, it's not necessarily a healthy way to be, because you can always do more. You can always do more research, and insights are always changing. And so particularly now, actually, I think it's fascinating that very few of us are expert in anything because the world is moving so fast.
Yeah.
And that becomes quite hard if you always hold yourself up to be this kind of very, very knowledgeable source on something. It was great as a planner, but it became harder and harder to feel confident in the research I was doing because the world was moving quicker, and I eventually ended up in perimenopause, and my brain just wasn't able to retain that knowledge. And I wasn't able to kind of say, yeah, leave it with me for 24 hours and I'll tell you everything there is to know about the telco industry. That used to be my sort of superpower. I could go off and absorb really complicated text and come back and have an opinion. And that's kind of how I survived as an MD, I guess.
And that superpower, or at least that the ambition of that superpower, is now to make middle age. And I say that as I desperately cling on to that era, but to make middle age a superpower, and I guess therefore leads us beautifully, seamlessly into MPowder, which is where I was really keen to make the core, because I think it's such I think when first we spoke, it's a subject that it struck me through our discussion, just simply the menopause doesn't get talked about. And I think my sense is, perhaps naively, but nonetheless, certainly from an informed point of view, it's misunderstood. As we said, it's not talked about, it's not discussed, it's not widely tackled as an issue, if you like, or as something to address. And yet more than half the planet will go through it. It seemed when that alone struck me as being utterly ludicrous, especially as we're thankfully starting slowly but surely to exist in a world where many, many more things are discussed, whether it be mental health or sexuality, diversity, whatever it may be. All of these things are starting to form part of a discussion. Not enough, but they're starting. But that seems, even now, the menopause seems something, though, it's not discussed. So tell us about, where did the inspiration, where does MPowder come from? And we'll perhaps go on to explore what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and it was a very personal experience. So I was happily in my role as a planner. As you probably can tell by my descriptions, I genuinely love that as a role, as a discipline, learning about people, learning about the roles of companies in the world and how that's evolved, that sense of businesses needing to deliver much more than a product, to add value to people's lives. And I was working increasingly with ethical businesses, so I was very, very engaged with my job. And what I found from about the age of 43 was the sort of the imposter syndrome that I'd already mentioned to you, but I'd struggled with throughout my career. I think partly being female, partly always feeling that I was winging it a little bit, not understanding that's how we all feel, began to trip me up. And in retrospect, obviously, I now know that was the beginnings of perimenopause. But at the time, as a researcher, to not feel confident on your conclusions is basically kryptonite. It's kind of it's so hard, because what you're paid for essentially by a brand to do is to go and look at all that desk research and look at the macro trends that are taking place, listen, talk, absorb all this content. And then the trick is putting all those threads together into something that's lyrical and original and creative that they can then use as a platform to engage with their target audience. And I became less and less confident in my ability to do that well. And the way that I dealt with it was by just working harder. So I've always been very, very committed to my work and a perfectionist. But again, it made me ill. So, because I was finding it hard to remember words and I didn't understand that was brain fog and part of a biochemical stage, I just got up earlier. So if I had a presentation that was at 10, I'd get up at 5 and I would script it and I'd learn it off by heart so I could go in and sound like I was talking off the cuff, but everything had been rehearsed for hours in the morning to make sure that I felt that I could deliver the content I wanted to convey well. without losing my words. And obviously it made me really unwell. I wasn't sleeping.
I was going to say, what impact does that have? That's almost, I guess I understand the rationale and the thinking behind it and why you were doing what you were doing, but then what impact that has from a health perspective. You're driving yourself into a spiral.
Yeah, exactly. So, I thought that there was something really, really wrong with me, because I was forgetting the words for things, like lamppost, or, I just like everyday things I couldn't even label. It was a kind of joke in the house, but it really wasn't that funny because it was really frustrating. You'd get halfway through a sentence and you just couldn't grasp the word that you needed to complete what you were trying to say to your slightly petulant teenager. It was really frightening. And for me as well, my father had MS and had MS from when I was around 15. And so I had a sort of like this deep-seated fear that the tingling in my body, the bone ache, the difficulty with words, the inability to complete a sentence, that may mean that I had MS too. And so I went through a process of having lots and lots of tests and scans, and everything came back and they couldn't quite identify what was going wrong. I kind of left it for a couple of years and struggled on, and I was putting on weight and my skin was terrible, my hair was thinning. I felt very, very unwell, and I finally went back to my GP, feeling quite embarrassed actually, because I'd had a series of tests at expense. You're kind of aware that you're being sent into the NHS with nothing really going on, and all of these things come back fine. And I sort of finally went back and said, I feel really unwell and I'm really not coping. And the diagnosis, which I now know happens to about 75% of women who end up in the doctor's surgery at this life stage, was that I was burnt out, which I probably was, but I was burnt out because of perimenopause. But I was told I was too young. And this is the biggest issue really with this life stage, to your point. It's not just that it's not talked about, it's that it's not taught either. So most GPs, it is slowly changing. I think it will change in the UK faster than it will do elsewhere. But for most GPs in practice currently, they won't have covered menopause. If they have, they've done it for about 4 hours. And it's such a complex biological life stage in terms of the way that the symptoms manifest themselves. It's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to join the dots for you. I went in with anxiety, bloating, gut ache, hormonal skin outbreaks, thinning hair. He just looked at me and just thought, you need a break and you probably need some supplements.
And to your point around that lack of, I guess best way to categorize it, lack of understanding or lack of knowledge, why is that? Is that an issue around society? It's a taboo subject. Is it there isn't the funding? There's never been that sort of pressing sense of, well, this is something we must address. What's the story, if you like, as to why it doesn't feature as prominently, given the amount of people that experience it, that it should do? Yeah,
I often use the analogy of pregnancy, in that it's 8-9 months of your life. There's 3 trimesters. We're all taught about it at school. The medical profession places huge focus on the safety of that fetus, the safety of childbirth, child rearing, etc. And society as a whole, we all understand how you get pregnant, how not to get pregnant, all of the implications that come with it. And yet menopause is 8 or 9 years of a woman's life, and there are 3 stages. So effectively there's 3 trimesters, and doctors most commonly are taught about menopause as a single date. So menopause itself is simply the anniversary of your 12 months since you last had a bleed. And so all of that period that most of us feel the worst is a bit like your first trimester in pregnancy, where you can't tell anyone you're pregnant, but you're feeling nauseous and faint and you're struggling on the tube, but you don't look pregnant, so you don't tell anyone. And you kind of got this kind of taboo around not wanting to jinx the baby. So we all keep very quiet about it in the UK. And perimenopause is the same. Perimenopause is that period where your hormones are fluctuating the most and the symptoms are often at the most severe. And yet none of us are taught about it. And I think, the reason for that is there are many, but is the fact it goes right back to medical research and the fact that women are very often absent from any medical research. And so fertility and puberty are the 2 exceptions, and the rest of the female body is largely a black box. There's also the funding. So, in terms of funding for research, 2% of funding in the UK currently goes to female health.
2%?
And of that, you can imagine the tiny amount that goes to menopause. Within sort of generic trials for human conditions, women are very often absent from trials. Even the animals are very rarely female in testing. So women are disproportionately more likely to struggle with sort of negative reactions to drugs that have been approved for use. They're most often withdrawn from market because of sort of adverse reactions by women, because we've not been in the trials. And when it comes to sort of hormonal orientated conditions, which effectively is what menopause is, it's your hormone fluctuations and the ceasing of certain hormones within your body. There just isn't the research into it. So when you then become a doctor, there's not the education around how to treat it. And as a society, because we don't talk about it, there's not the education in school to prepare us as individuals who will experience it, but also it's a societal issue. So it's only in the last year that the UK has legislated to have menopause part of biology lessons in secondary school, which is brilliant, but also outrageous.
Well, to your point, it's a long time ago since I was at school, but I can't remember ever it being a subject that was discussed. We did the usual, puberty, reproduction, all the usual things you do in biology. Menopause was, I didn't even know, to your point around that 12-month definition, if you like. Is that is kind of the medical definition of menopause as it exists today? That's as complex as it gets for something that lasts 9 years.
Yeah, and who tracks that anyway? Ask any woman struggling with brain fog to tell you when they last had a period. We don't know. So many of us struggle through, and I think because it's a taboo subject, because, again, there's a huge amount of research around how women's pain and medical concerns aren't taken seriously in the surgery. So we tend to just endure, and we're really good at it. That doesn't necessarily mean we should. So what tends to happen is if you talk to the generation above the generation experiencing menopause now, so my mother's generation, they will tell you they can't remember menopause, or they'll say, "Oh, it was fine, it just kind of happened." And then you'll sort of think a bit further and you'll be like, "Was that when you left work, Mum, because work got a bit much? Or was that when you separated from your partner? Or was that when you had to go on antidepressants because you were feeling really low at the time? Or was that when you had extreme problems with weight gain because your bones were too sore for you to move, and you ended up being put on various medications to treat other conditions?" And actually, for many women, the minute you start probing about other life events that happened around that time, they join the dots together themselves, but they were a generation who didn't talk about it. Go back a generation further, and women were institutionalized who were really struggling with mood swings and things like that. And you've got a whole generation of people who are put on antidepressants who shouldn't be. And that again, is a very common occurrence in the GP surgery now, that you'll be given an antidepressant rather than HRT. So it's a gender issue, it's a diversity issue. Women leave the workplace in droves in this life stage because, like me, they feel unable to do their job well anymore. So they're not necessarily choosing to downsize, they just feel they're not able to do their job. And that means that a whole generation of women coming in can't see older women in the workplace. So it has massive impact on society, on relationships, on you talk to kids who have experienced, a mother going through menopause and not understanding what that sort of slightly erratic behaviour is. It can be incredibly damaging to households and to, the whole network of friendships and things that you have. So it's a really, really urgent topic to be discussing. And I think, the exciting thing is it's kind of happening. I think it's happening in part because what you've got now is a group of women who have senior enough positions in many places to make their voices heard. So I don't think it's a coincidence that, 1 in 3 editors in the UK now is a woman, and there's more media coverage about this life stage because they're hitting the same wall I did and going, hang on a minute, why is no one writing about this? And why is this not being talked about? Everyone from Davina McCall, these celebrities who have a platform in which to share their stories, and they're used to sharing their personal stories because that's how our relationship with celebrities works now. And so inevitably they get to menopause and they share that too. And we suddenly understand that they're struggling as much as we are. And so I think it is changing, but not that swiftly.
And so instinctively, I want to ask, what's the answer? But that strikes me that is a whole series of podcasts. And it's not something that could be answered. So at what point did you decide there's a way I can address this using my business experience, using my creative expertise, the knowledge I've acquired through my career? I can start to tackle some of these issues, and there's a business case for this.
Yeah, I think because of my background as a researcher or planner, when I left the doctor's surgery and he told me to go and look at the supplements, I think I've spoken to you before about that as an experience which is pretty miserable. And so I often describe that menopause shelf in your health food store as the end of life aisle, because it's just full of very, very underwhelming imagery of very frail individuals, usually in cornfields or on bicycles. So I was kind of in that section of the supplement store, and I just began to think, this is odd. So I guess my planning brain kicked in. I looked at it and I thought, it doesn't resonate with me, so it's really bad branding, and that upsets me. And also, it feels like a really blunt instrument for what is a life stage that 51% of the population will go through. And we're a generation that's been influenced up by millennials. Where is the stuff that comes with the authenticity that I'd expect from a brand? All of the brands in that particular aisle, they felt like the old school pharmaceuticals from the 1980s, where you kind of know you're getting synthetic doses and it's probably not going to do much good, and you kind of feel a little bit played. And yet there was nothing there that sort of spoke to me as a woman who still felt relevant, and I was looking for a brand that was going to tell me the truth as well. So when I did find products, they were either over-promising or there just wasn't enough evidence to support efficacy. And so I was confused. So my first step wasn't about starting a business. It was really, what do I need to take to feel better? Because I really don't want to be on antidepressants. I really don't think I'm burnt out, but I'm beginning to read about this thing called perimenopause, and maybe there's some things I need to change. And I knew that my anxiety meant that I knew that this 5 a.m. start in order to be able to deliver a 10 a.m. presentation was not healthy. And so I was very interested in how do you deal with anxiety when it hits? What am I doing wrong? And so it was a 6-month period of everything from acupuncture to cold water therapy I became basically a human guinea pig. I bought a dehydration machine. I started to learn about functional food and how you could create shakes that would give you what you needed, but couldn't probably get on a plate. I started looking into the sort of medical research around the potential of minerals and vitamins in whole foods to support hormone imbalance. And I ended up with this really disgusting powder that I used to make myself. And so I learned how to dehydrate and condense down the foods that I was taking to ensure that I could get what I needed. And then slowly, as I started to feel better, I realized I'd got something that I'd done an awful lot, of in my typical way, wanting to become an absolute expert in it so I could effectively present to someone who was interested. I'd done the same for menopause. I'd really, really gone deep. And then I had all this knowledge, and I was like, well, I couldn't find anything for me. Maybe there's an opportunity to bring something to market that can actually make a difference. And that was really where it began. And I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a naturopath or herbalist, I'm not a doctor. So I then needed, again, sort of thinking back to Bite and finding the extra milers and these people that had the open, curious mindset to collaborate with me was the beginnings of the brand. So I started work, it took quite a while to find the right people. But when I did find the right people, they've been the ones that have really lifted it into a business. And I think the final thing that I was very conscious of, which again is the red thread back to being a researcher, is the voices of these women that have been ignored or effectively silenced by society need to be at the heart of what we do. And so we ended up with a business that co-creates, which is really unusual in the supplement space, in that we do all the due diligence, we do the homework and the difficult stuff in terms of researching dosage levels and where the evidence lies, and we make something, but then we give it to the audience and they try it for 2 months. And if it doesn't work, we refine it further. And if it does work, but it's really difficult to dilute or whatever, we refine with them. And so MPowder is a community first and foremost that then co-creates products that community has asked us for.
And what sort of barriers did you face to in terms of getting the business off the ground? Back to what we'd said earlier, the lack of discussion around the subject itself. Had that been your experience when you start to look at how you raise, for example, raising capital or whatever it may have been, those sorts of barriers typically, what sort of barriers did you experience as you were looking to get MPowder started?
A lot.
Yeah.
So, I think I ended up almost feeling like it was a confessional. So I used to have to go into these VC meetings. And again, obviously, invariably, VCs today are largely male. There are increasing number of females going into the space, but they're male. They tend to be younger than me. So, I'm 47 now. So I was doing my raise, a couple of years ago, 45. So I was older than these individuals at a different life stage, and I was talking about a subject they really didn't want me to mention. And I'd go in almost like a confession. I'd have to start it with, hello, my name's Rebekah and I'm perimenopausal. And then I'd have to explain what the menopause was. So, if you look back at my pitch deck, it's hilarious. Like the first 3 slides, is a really quick biology lesson. This is the body, this is what happens, and these are these stages. And just the jaw-dropping response, actually, from these guys who were just like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. This is awful. I had no idea this happened. I had no idea my mum went through this, or my sister might be going through this, or whatever. It made it really, really hard, because obviously, although we like to think we're scientific as humans, we're not. We instinctively go with stuff, and we're much more likely to go with stuff that resonates with us personally, or that we feel confident about because we're the target audience. And my main challenge with menopause was I wasn't speaking to anyone who's my target audience at all. And it took quite a long while for me to convince them that, 51% of the population isn't niche, and that that women needed this stuff, that women were desperate, in fact. And again, I think the research approach that I did, and that kind of due diligence robustness, at times I felt quite frustrated because I could see other ventures getting backed that really didn't have that diligence behind them. But in a way, I would have done that anyway, because that's just how my brain worked. But I was able to take to them the real human stories. I had trialists already who had fed back about the efficacy of our product. And so that helped me with the raise. But it was hard. And I think actually what's exciting is 2 years on, the menopause market is now the hot topic in terms of VCs, which is great. And so I think, again, there has been a fundamental shift in understanding that femtech, fem products, fem-focused businesses are actually, this market is horribly underserved, and I would love there to be more competition. I think there will be in coming months. So that was a huge barrier. And I think, the other barrier has been because of the lack of research, we've had to do it ourselves. So that's fine because I'm a researcher, but it is frustrating that you're always in a position where you're having to use your own trial, your own considerable investment on a very small raise to actually go out and find whether these products do what a really small trial gave an indication they may do. And I just think it's such a shame that the money hasn't been put into female health for us to be able to know what works. So we're kind of building our own knowledge bank at the moment because, as a woman, if you're going to the doctor and you get turned away with nothing, which 75% of women do currently, you don't pop back to tell them that omega-3 was really helpful. You just, so there's no knowledge base that says, do you know what? Acupuncture is really, really good. So it's all anecdotal. And if you're not careful, the interesting thing about our global sort of climate at the moment is that we have this love-hate relationship with science. In one breath we'll say, well, there's no research, so therefore it can't work. And yet you've got a whole body of women saying this stuff really works for me, or so I find that quite frustrating. That's probably our other biggest barrier, is that as a small startup, we're having to do the legwork that someone much bigger than us should have had the morals to do, because they're selling stuff in a space often with very similar ingredients to us, and yet no one's done the due diligence.
So what's your aim with, what do you hope for MPowder to achieve?
My hope is that it's twofold, that we reframe what midlife is about in terms of women growing up, and their perception of midlife and beyond is that it's a stepping up point, it's a liberation point rather than an end of life stage. That society recognises what the research actually does tell us, because there's loads of socio-economic research that points to the fact that women are more likely to be successful entrepreneurs post-menopause. They increase in empathy. We're one of the few animals that actually go through this life stage, but the others that do, that all live in the ocean, which I find fascinating, they live longer post-menopause because they are the wise ones in their pod or in their little network. They know where the food is. They know how to bring up the young. They know how to take care of dispute. And it's true for us as well. We gain in empathy. We become more confident in our own skin. We're actually really valuable to society. And yet, because menopause tends to happen sort of like at the same point that ageism kicks in, many women are scared of menopause. And so, my hope is that by reframing it, people aren't scared. Therefore, they get the information they need sooner to sort their hormone balance, and also the way that they manage their external stresses better, so that their menopause journey can be a healthy one, and that we can continue to develop products that women want that work, that we iterate and that we evolve and we become a global offering that can provide honest foundation layers. The other important thing about MPowder, and in my own experience too, is that there is no silver bullet. So to your question about how do you sort of fix menopause, or how do you make yourself better? What's the solution? There isn't one. As in anything in life, as in pregnancy, when you actually have an honest conversation about what that experience was like for women, it's really individual. And so having the honesty to kind of talk to that and give women the tools and the agency to work out what's right for them at different points, is our goal.
So you mentioned community, and therefore those that are listening, where can they find you? Where can they find out more? Where can they engage with that community? Where should they go? Where should we point them?
We're in many places, but probably the best place to sort of get a little bit of a sense of the content and the community that we facilitate is on Instagram. So we're at MPowder Store, all one word. It's an environment where we post a lot of research insights, ours and other medical or research bodies, where we tell the stories of individuals transitioning through menopause, where we sort of celebrate the wins, where we explore stuff with curious minds. So it's a good place to come and maybe find something that could inspire or guide you if you're struggling, or your partner or someone may be struggling too. We have a closed Facebook group called the Powder Room, which is where women come and share more intimate details and where events are held. And we also have an open event platform, so you can find us on Eventbrite. And then the product itself is available at Cult Beauty, Gazelle House, the drugstore, but you can also buy direct from us at www.mpowder.store.
Rebekah, this is fascinating. I think if I might leave our listeners in the knowledge that I would wish that we could do this again, because there are so many topics that I would want to explore, not least to understand how MPowder is evolving. But I do think that anything, I think I've learned a huge amount. I'm embarrassed to say, or perhaps ashamed to say, just in this short spell that we've had to discuss what clearly is such a critical issue and not widely discussed, I've learned a huge amount. Just sitting here has left me a jaw dropping on more than one occasion you will have seen. So I'd love to be able to do this again.
Yeah, I would love that. I
think there is a part 2 to come, because there's just so much to unpick, not least as well from your own perspective.
Yeah, and I think I'm an optimist at heart, and I think the really exciting thing is, and maybe it is, as a result of the last 18 months or whatever that we've lived through as a society, is that we're learning more and more, to your point at the beginning of this conversation around quite a number of the taboo topics are being challenged and addressed and explored by us as a society. And I kind of feel that the same is true for menopause, that there's, the conversations have to be had. That's the first step. And there's no shame or embarrassment in not knowing, because women don't know either. I felt really stupid not knowing that this was a thing that happened to people, and so it's even harder. It happened to me and I didn't know it was coming. So I think, no one should feel embarrassed that they don't know about it. But I think what's exciting is that because the conversations are happening, because education is now coming to light, hopefully the experience that I had and a lot of the women in my community have had won't be the same. In a couple of years' time, when we'll go into the doctors and the doctor will be able to help from day one.
He's hoping so. If you look at the journey that has been made, for example, with mental health, I know that I've always drawn, perhaps somewhat poorly, but the analogy with you break a leg, you end up with a cast on your leg. People can point to it, they can see it. It's very tangible. They say, "Poor you. How did that happen?" And they're invoked. So and it generates, not necessarily that people would do it for that point, but there is a sympathy that comes with it, and an understanding and a recognition. But if you go through mental health, once upon a time, the conversation would have been, "Well, pull yourself together. Stiff upper lip. What have you got to feel sorry for yourself about? Come on, pull through." I would imagine your reference earlier, if you were to speak with perhaps your mother or older generations of women that might have been through it, that perhaps their mothers would have said to them, "Well, it's just something we go through, and pull yourself together and stiff upper lip, away we go." So the fact that it's another one of those very, very important things that hopefully the more discussion that can start to take place will aid greater understanding, and you become then that part of that virtuous circle that starts to expand research and funding and so on and so on and so on.
Exactly.
That's probably a naive perspective and perhaps a blue sky view, but nonetheless, my hope is that the more discussions like this that can take place, the better good will come from it. But I really, really appreciate your time this afternoon. I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. MPowder.store. We'll make sure we'll get all the references to the Facebook group in the show notes, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you. And I wish you every success in your endeavors.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rebekah. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Astrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.